It's really amazing. You know, it's like some kind of biblical, epical, unbelievable scene.
What happened at White Lake this weekend may have been more than an uncontrolled outpouring of hip young people, struggling as they did to survive. First, the 20-mile traffic jams and 5-mile hikes, then the intense heat and sudden rain, the thirst and hunger from the shortage of water and food, just for the opportunity to spend a few days in the country getting stoned on their drugs and grooving on the music.
In the summer of 1969, as more than 400,000 people gathered in a muddy field in upstate New York to witness what would later be mythologized as a cultural landmark, several of music's most significant figures were nowhere to be seen. The absence of the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Led Zeppelin, and others has fueled speculation ever since. Their decisions not to attend weren't incidental. They were calculated, circumstantial, or in some cases, tragically misjudged. While the lineup at Woodstock was formidable, it might have been even more historic had these 7 artists, among the most iconic of their generation, agreed to perform. Instead, each declined for reasons that reveal as much about the music industry at the end of the 60s as they do about the artists themselves. Yet what unites these absentees is not simply the fame they carried or the hits they amassed. It is the complex intersection of timing, ego, uncertainty, and strategy that framed their decisions. Still, for each, the refusal came at a cost. By 1969, the Beatles were arguably the most famous band in the world.
Why do you like them so much?
I don't know, there's just something about them. I don't know, when they sing.
Aren't they as good as anybody else?
No, they're better.
Like the Beatles? Yeah, they're pretty good.
But internally, they were fracturing. The group had ceased touring in 1966 and had since taken refuge in the studio, where tensions only grew. Although Woodstock organizers were keen to secure their presence, the offer came at a time of spiraling dysfunction. Promoter Michael Lang later said, "Of course we reached out to the Beatles, but John Lennon insisted on including the Plastic Ono Band, and the promoters just weren't going to go for that." George Harrison, increasingly disillusioned with the band's internal politics, had distanced himself entirely. "There was no way we were going to play live again, especially not in that sort of environment," Ringo Starr recalled. Moreover, visa issues complicated matters. Lennon, already facing scrutiny from US immigration authorities due to a drug conviction, was unlikely to be granted clearance. The Beatles were retreating from the world stage, both physically and emotionally. Their decision not to attend was a reflection of their gradual descent into dissolution. But even as their absence signaled a broader internal malaise, another local icon was staging his own quiet rebellion. Despite residing just a few miles from the festival grounds, Bob Dylan gave Woodstock a wide berth.
Rivers that ran through every day that I must have been there.
To the organizers, securing Dylan would have been a masterstroke. But for Dylan, who had spent the previous 3 years withdrawing from public life, it was precisely the kind of spectacle he wished to avoid. He wasn't in the mood for the chaos, said his road manager at the time, Jonathan Taplin. His kid was sick, and he didn't want the disruption near his home. Dylan's aversion to being treated as a counterculture figurehead was also at play. "I don't belong to any group," he would later say. "I'm just me." Ironically, Dylan played the Isle of Wight festival just weeks later, a far more sedate affair, perhaps more in keeping with his self-imposed exile from the madness of the American scene.
2 of the world's most iconic music festivals took place, while hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Woodstock near New York. Its most famous resident, Bob Dylan, wasn't there. He was instead performing in a field on the Isle of Wight.
Still, his decision left a conspicuous gap at a festival many believed was practically built around his legend. Yet if Dylan declined out of weariness, the next act refused out of disdain. Led Zeppelin were on a meteoric rise in 1969, having released their debut album to considerable acclaim and built a reputation for ferocious live performances. Their presence at Woodstock would have electrified the lineup, but their manager, the formidable Peter Grant, dismissed the idea outright. "We were asked to do Woodstock," Grant once said, "and I said no because we'd just have been another band on the bill. I wanted them to be headliners, not one of 20. Grant's strategy was to elevate Zeppelin above the festival circuit, building their mythology on exclusivity and theatricality rather than inclusion. They needed to be seen as the main event, he later explained. It worked. The band continued to grow in stature without ever associating with Woodstock's muddied legacy. Yet their absence is still regarded by fans as one of the festival's greatest what-ifs. While Zeppelin's refusal was about image, the next artist's decision was shaped by pragmatism. In the summer of 1969, Simon and Garfunkel were immersed in recording what would become Bridge Over Troubled Water, one of the most celebrated albums of the era. The duo received the Woodstock invitation, but declined without much hesitation. "We were deep into the album," Paul Simon explained. "It didn't feel like the right time to go off and do a festival." Art Garfunkel concurred, later describing the offer as a distraction more than an opportunity. Their choice was not rooted in aloofness or disdain. Rather, it was an example of a duo so focused on craftsmanship that the thought of abandoning it, even temporarily, was deemed counterproductive. However, the decision came with a cultural cost. As other artists saw their profiles soar in the wake of Woodstock, Simon and Garfunkel missed out on the chance to connect with the counterculture movement in a deeply visceral way. And for the next act, the consequences of missing Woodstock were even more personal. Of all the artists who missed Woodstock, none was more spiritually connected to it than Joanie Mitchell. She was scheduled to appear, but was persuaded by her manager David Geffen to stay in New York for an appearance on the Dick Cavett Show.
You just tuned in, I'm Dick Cavett, and we're sitting here in my living room. Not exactly. We have these are the Jefferson Airplanes, should you be so foolish as to have just joined us, and Joanie Mitchell, and we have...
David told me it would be a mess, she recalled. He was worried I wouldn't get back in time for the TV slot. Mitchell watched the festival unfold on television in her hotel room, writing her now legendary song, Woodstock, not from memory, but from imagination.
He was walking along the road, and I asked him, I said, "Where are you going?" And this he told.
"I was the only person at Woodstock who wasn't there," she later said wryly. The irony is profound. Her song became one of the defining anthems of the event, covered famously by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Yet she herself never experienced the mud, the music, or the madness. If Mitchell was locked out by timing, another artist's decision reflected outright contempt. Jim Morrison had no time for outdoor festivals. He loathed the lack of control, the unpredictability, the frenzy of large-scale gatherings.
Meager food for souls forgot. I tell you this.
The Doors were invited to Woodstock, and some reports suggest they even briefly considered it. But ultimately, Morrison's paranoia and reluctance overrode the band's interest. Jim didn't like festivals, keyboardist Ray Manzarek said. He thought they were disorganized and unsafe. He didn't want people rushing the stage. By 1969, Morrison's behavior had grown erratic. He had recently been arrested on stage in Miami, and his performances were becoming more unpredictable by the day. A festival like Woodstock, drug-fueled, anarchic, unscripted, was Morrison's worst nightmare. As a result, one of the decade's most incendiary bands missed its defining moment. But while Morrison fled the crowd, another legend simply didn't believe the festival mattered. In 1969, Eric Clapton was consumed with launching his new band, Blind Faith. Alongside Steve Winwood, He was crafting a project that, at least initially, seemed like the next great supergroup. When Woodstock came calling, Clapton barely blinked. "I don't even remember hearing much about it," he later admitted. "We were rehearsing all the time, getting ready for the tour." It was a matter of poor timing, rather than disinterest. But by missing the festival, Clapton missed out on one of the biggest collective rites of passage in rock history. Blind faith fizzled quickly. Within a year, the band was over, and the promise of that new beginning had already faded. Yet for all 7 artists, the real story is not about what they missed, it's about what they chose instead. In retrospect, refusing Woodstock did not damage any of these artists in the long term. The Beatles disbanded, but left behind a revolutionary legacy. Dylan re-emerged on his own terms. Led Zeppelin became stadium gods. Simon and Garfunkel topped charts worldwide. Joanie Mitchell wrote one of the most iconic songs of the era. The Doors cemented their legend, and Clapton found success again and again. Yet their collective absence serves as a fascinating counter-narrative to the Woodstock myth. The festival did not capture everyone, nor was it embraced by all. Some artists simply didn't need it. Others perhaps underestimated it. And in the end, the sound of their silence at Woodstock is almost as revealing as the music that was played.